Welcome to A Language I Love Is, a podcast all about languages and the people who love them. It's the second series. I'm still your host, Danny, and after the very positive response to the first 15 episodes last year, I've been so keen to get stuck into making more lovely linguistic content. That enthusiasm has meant that I've decided not to make any changes to the format of the last series, at least not yet. I've considered many ideas over December and January, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now that I've rounded up enough willing linguists, this second series of adventures into a variety of beloved languages can begin. If you're a returning listener, welcome back. If you're new to this podcast, also welcome, and allow me briefly to explain how A Language I Love Is works. This show is your chance to get to know different languages of the world, being introduced by expert individuals who have a real passion and personal connection to them. The format remains the same for each episode, but is designed to be open-ended and to give my guests room to tell us what they think we should know. There are 4 parts. The first, and usually the longest, is the language profile, in which we hear about the fundamentals, the what, who, where, when of the specific language. After that, it moves on to my 3 questions. What is your relationship to this language? What is something that you love about this language? And what is something that you think the audience should know about this language? Through these 4 parts, the goal is that you, dear listener, will end up feeling just as informed and enthused about the starring language of each episode. So, without further ado, let's begin the second series and join Jeremy Bradley on a journey into Mari. To kick off the second series, I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Jeremy Bradley from the University of Vienna, where he is a postdoc researcher in Finno-Ugric studies. Previously been in Vienna, he's been in Helsinki, he's been in Munich, and he's come along today to talk about one language which I dare say will not be known to the majority of listeners, but that's great, that's what this show is all about. So, first things first, Jeremy, how are you doing today, and how is life in Vienna at the moment?
Great, thanks, and thanks for the invitation.
Right, so, Jeremy, let's start with the big question. What is a language that you love?
A language that I love is Mari. It is a Finno-Ugric or Uralic language, spoken roughly 1,000 kilometers east of Moscow, which places it, compared to the Uralic languages that listeners might have heard of, fairly far to the east. It's actually relatively central if you look at the spread of the Uralic languages.
Right, so already we've got some terms that may be new to people, so let's dig into those. When you say Finno-Ugric, you're talking about a language family. This is a very large language family, large in terms of the number of its members, large in terms of its geographical spread. So could you introduce this family and the wider genealogy of Mari? What are some of its linguistic cousins that people might have heard of?
So the linguistic cousins of Mari that people might have heard of are Hungarian, Finnish, Estonian, and possibly the Sami languages of northern Fennoscania, historically known under the term Lap. And all of these languages are on the western periphery of the language family. A problem in linguistics in general is that when people want to make assumptions about a language family, they will access the data that is accessible to them, understandably so. But this creates a certain availability heuristics. It creates a certain bias that people want to know how things work in Uralic languages. They look at things in the Uralic languages that they can access, which are then Hungarian, Finnish, Estonian. And oftentimes they will then be looking at European contact features. Like, to give you just a random example, looking at all of these languages, you might assume that Uralic languages like to use relative pronouns, as we do in English. The man that is sleeping on the bench is my brother. Most Uralic languages don't do that. Most Uralic languages use participle constructions. They would say the under the bench sleeping man is my brother. This is specifically a European contact influence that we see on the western periphery of our language family. It is fun working with language that is spoken a bit further to the east, where a lot of the assumptions that one would make by just scratching the surface of Uralic, by looking at the most European Uralic languages that we have, simply don't hold anymore.
Fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. So, as a field, linguists really need to work with languages like Mari if we're going to talk correctly about the Finno-Ugric family. That is absolutely fascinating. So yeah, it's great work that you and your linguist friends are doing. Fantastic. I'm just wondering though, can we clarify that there is enormous distance between the different members of the family that you have mentioned? So we've got Hungarian in Central Europe, we've got Finnish and Estonian to the north, and then we've got Mari far to the east. But it's not only geographical distance, it's also time distance. These languages have been separated for a very long time. So it's been many centuries since they were one. And consequently, is it fair to say that a Mari speaker won't understand Hungarian?
Absolutely. So the relationship between Mari and Hungarian is one where I have to use the tools of historical linguistics to even show that there is any connection there. It is not in any way plainly visible. And some of the similarities that we do have between Mari and Hungarian, for example, in vocabulary, are through shared contact influence. So we have some words that sound similar in the two languages, like we have the Hungarian word sör, meaning beer, which in Mari is sera. Sounds somewhat similar. It goes back to the same root, but this is Turkic. It's a Turkic word in both of these languages. So like shared word stock is there's relatively little of it. If we want to compare Mari with Finnish or Estonian, this is a case where I can also make people without any background in linguistics see that, oh yeah, there is some connection between these. I can find enough words that sound similar enough that people see some kind of connection, but they don't understand anything. I can give you an example. If I were to count to 6, in Estonian, it would be yks, kaks, kolm, neli, viis, kuus, and in Mari, it would be ik, kok, kum, nul, vich, kut. So it's like if I count to 6 in Mari in front of an Estonian speaker and ask them what was that, they'll say, "Oh, you just counted to 6, didn't you?" But there's a big difference between being able to recognize that somebody is counting to 6 and actually understanding the first thing that a person says. So there is absolutely no mutual comprehension between, let's say, Mari and Finnish or Mari and Estonian. And also to put this in very colloquial terms, the sounds of the language is very, very different, just due to the different histories that these languages have had, both just the arbitrariness that comes with speakers spending thousands of years separated from one another and having arbitrary shifts in different directions, but also just the different contact influences. Mari has been subject to enormous contact influence from Turkic languages, and especially like in prosody, in accent and whatnot. Mari, like when you hear it for the first time, you might more think, oh, this sounds more like Turkish than it sounds like Finnish.
That's really good to know. Some excellent examples there. I really like the idea of, Mari speakers and Estonian speakers meeting up. And yeah, outside of a primary school maths lesson, there's not much that they're going to be able to recognize in one another's language. As far as I know my early medieval history, we know that the Hungarians, the Magyars, come from very far away. We see them in the historical record arriving in what is now Hungary. So can we assume that something like Hungarian has been on a much longer geographical journey, whereas Mari remains much closer to where the homeland of all these languages once was? Is Mari still in the area where they all come from?
Well, yes and no. What is definitely true is Hungarian is the wild child of the language family, and that is the only language in our family where it happened within recorded history that the speakers arrived in where the language is spoken now. And there's actually a strange connection between Mari and Hungarian in this respect, is that there are not 100% certain, but quite plausible historical accounts of a variety of Hungarian spoken in the Volga region in modern-day Bashkortostan up to the 13th century. That it was only during the Mongol invasions that the Eastern Hungarian community in modern-day Bashkortostan was destroyed. And Bashkortostan, which is like 1,200 kilometers east of Moscow, my rough and probably incorrect guess. In Bashkortostan, primarily Turkic-speaking region, you also have a large Mari community there today. So Mari is spoken close to where Hungarian was still spoken up to the 13th century. But this is not to say that the Mari have been completely sedentary. Most of the toponyms in where Mari is spoken today in the so-called Republic of Mari-El, a constituent republic of the Russian Federation, most of the toponyms there, they are Finno-Ugric, but they are actually Permic, which is a different branch of the language family from Mari. This is the branch of the language family to which Udmurt and Komi belong. And historical records imply that the Mari used to live further to the southwest from where they live now, and that where Permic languages today are spoken to the northeast of where Mari is spoken. The historical record implies that there was sort of a bit of a sort of a chain migration, that the Permic speakers moved to the northeast, the Mari speakers moved to the northeast, the Turkic speakers moved to the northeast. So you did have languages belonging to the same language family spoken in this region for a long time. But it is not the case that historical records, archaeological records imply that the linguistic ancestors of Mari, the direct ancestors, have been living in this exact same space for centuries, millennia, or something like that. But yeah, it is definitely true that Mari is, unlike Hungarian, spoken within the wider range of where the language family is assumed to have been spoken long, long ago, as exemplified by the fact that Hungarian used to be spoken in this very region, which is where we get some of the linguistic similarities between Mari and Hungarian with loanwords from the same donor languages.
So, staying with the history of this language, everything that you've mentioned, I think, is pre-history. So this is before the written record for Mari begins. When does that begin? So when do we first start to get sources for Mari? Is it a very early documented language, or is it a late arrival into history?
It is a late arrival. We know from medieval chroniclers that the Maris existed, but medieval chroniclers were primarily concerned with who's around to pay taxes, who's around to pay tribute to us, and very little interest in the ethno-linguistic background of the people who are to pay the taxes. The Maris primarily were subject to the so-called Khanate of Kazan, a Turkic Islamic state, one of the successors of the Mongol Empire, centered in Kazan. There were also Mari communities subject to the Muscovite crown. We have records of the Maris existing, but the earliest text we have in Mari was collected around the year 1700, which is quite late in the game, obviously. It was collected, or it was brought about by on the initiative of Nicolas Wietzen, the mayor of Amsterdam, who was also a big language enthusiast, who managed to get some of his people in Russia to go and visit various minority groups and elicit some texts from them. Of course, around 1700, we're not going to have good methods of language documentation at the time. What they did is that they found speakers of Mari who were a community, a non-Christian community up to today. The Maris are majority not Christian. The dominant religion among the Maris is a folk religion that is often by external sources called paganism. I personally try to avoid this term. But you had a community of people who are not Christian. They did not speak Russian very well. So you have somebody sent by the mayor of Amsterdam, comes to this community and asks them to translate the Lord's Prayer into Mari. So the first text we have in Mari is a translation of the Lord's Prayer into a very strange seeming form of Mari. And it is strange for multiple reasons. Like, firstly, the person writing it down did not know Mari, did not know the sounds of the language, and just wrote as best they heard what they could hear. But it also seems very clear that whoever was producing the Mari text didn't really understand what these people want from them. And there's this very curious thing in the text. If you look at the Mari text, like, some parts of it are relatively easy to figure out what they were trying to say, and there are some parts that are very strange. And one thing that seems very strange is in this first text of Mari, it is said, "Thy name might be enlightened," or "Thy name shall shine." Which, if you know your Lord's Prayer, that's not actually in there. That seems strange. Why should your name shine?
Hallowed be thy name, as I remember it.
That is correct. Well, the answer to what happened here is actually not in Mari, but it is in Slavic. If you know Slavic languages, you might know that the words for light and holy are somewhat similar in many of them. And even though in Russian of the time, these stems were distinct, there was a difference between holy be or hallowed be thy name and light be your name. We have interactions between people who did not know Russian that well. So the clearest assumption is that they just people, these non-Christian people who did not know Russian very well, and I don't know how well the people eliciting the data knew Russian, they just misunderstood what was asked from them. So we have these very early, this is the earliest text we have in Mari, which is like, it's very hard to make heads or tails of this. Over the course of the 18th century, we ended up having a bit more data collected. And in 1775, we have the first grammar of Mari being collected. But we only start having sizable texts in Mari starting towards the end of the 19th century. And in the late 19th century, early 20th century, we had a so-called a golden period of language documentation, when initially Finnish scholars would travel to the various speaker communities of the various kindred peoples in Russia and just elicit what they can from them. This was sort of tied to the Finnish national awakening and a desire in Finland to learn as much as you can about all our linguistic cousins. And then a lot of language data was collected by Hungarian scholars during the First World War from Mari prisoners of war in Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war camp.
That's a twist I did not expect. That's very interesting. This is all wonderful history, and I can talk about this, well, for the entirety of the episode, being very much a historian at heart. But let's bring this into the present day. I think people listening will be wondering, what's the status of this language today? It's not a historical language. It's still spoken within the Russian Federation. So could you just tell us, what is the linguistic situation today? How many people speak Mari? And also, the question that comes immediately to my mind is it endangered? Is it under threat from the serious influence within the Russian Federation of Russian?
So it is definitely endangered. It is hard to put numbers to these questions because all we have are the population censuses, and the population censuses only can register how people self-report, and population censuses also often don't have questions set in a way to optimally address multilingualism, which is not optimal when we are in communities where you basically do not have monolingual speakers at all anymore. But depending on how much we trust population census, there are clearly hundreds of thousands of speakers of Mari left. It seems a good estimate that there are more speakers of Mari than there are speakers of Icelandic. Nevertheless, Mari is definitely more endangered than Icelandic is because of the trends. The transmission to younger generations is becoming increasingly difficult. Mari has, over recent decades, been losing its structural standing, especially its standing as a language of education, and has been increasingly delegated to being the language of the home, inter-community language, a kitchen language, if you will. And even in that domain, transmission to very young speakers is vulnerable. So you have hundreds of thousands of speakers, but very worrying trends.
So you've mentioned already that the majority of Maris live within the Mari L Republic, which is a subdivision of the Russian Federation today. Does Mari have any sort of special legal status within that republic? Is it a language of the administration, for example? I'm just wondering because it's when you have some sort of protection and reason to use the language publicly that languages survive. What's the status there?
Yeah, so it's actually more like about half of the Mari speakers live in the Republic of Mari El, because the title republics of the communities in Russia, they do not sharply adhere to the boundaries between speaker communities, which is understandable because there are no sharp boundaries between speaker communities. In a lot of these areas, you will have scattered villages of different communities within one area, and you can't draw a clear line between them. Within the Republic of Mari, Mari is a national language, so it does have a legal status there. But currently, the legal protections Mari have are a bit theoretical and toothless, in that it will say that, like, the laws in the Republic of Mariel will say that education must be guaranteed in Mari. Great. Within what the schools deem manageable under given conditions, which of course gives carte blanche to do nothing if you don't feel like it. And often it's like, if you actually go to a public administration authority in the Republic of Mariel and try to speak Mari with people, they'll think that you're making fun of them, that you're pranking them. It's just considered not a normal thing to do. Not within the Mariel Republic, but within the Komi Republic. That's Komi being another Finno-Ugric language. There's actually recently was a legal case about a young Komi speaker who, in front of a court, insisted on just speaking Komi and insisted on having translation into Komi, with the judge then saying, well, stop being silly, you're just making fun of us. Of course you speak Russian. And yeah, he does speak Russian, but he was making a point and he was making it effectively. So you have more legal protections for the language in theory than you have in practice. But the fact that it is illegal, that it has this legal standing, it's not completely meaningless. You have bilingual signage, for example, on street signs. You do have, for example, that all the laws are translated into Mari from Russian. I'm not sure how many people read them in Mari, but the translations exist, and they're great for us doing corpus linguistics to have all this body of legal texts that we have in Mari. And you do have some educational institutions, the state-funded educational institutions working with Mari. So having, like, on a university level, some Mari medium education, particularly pertaining to Mari itself.
I'd love to explore. I'm fascinated by that attitude you mentioned, the idea that if you spoke this as an outsider to the community, it would come across as mocking. Where is that coming from? Is it because it's felt to be really a language of the home, that the person who might feel the mocking would themselves speak this language but not want to speak it in public because they want to be seen as a Russian citizen, as somebody who is, in vogue, I suppose? Is there a sense that Mari is a bit of a backwater language, a humble language, not something that in the minds of its speakers should be a public thing? Can we dig into that attitude and why people might have that reaction?
So there's a saying in Russian that the Russian is the so-called язык международной коммуникации, the language of intercultural communication. And this is today a very solidly held attitude, both within majority and minority communities. And there's some history here too, that for the Maris, there always was a dominant language of intercultural communication. It is fairly recent that it is Russian, but there always was something. Like up to the 1970s, for a lot of especially Eastern Mari communities, the language of intercultural communication was Tatar. That if you had, like, in Bashkortostan, if you had somebody from a Mari village interacting with somebody from Udmurt village, that being another Finno-Ugric language with no mutual intelligibility, they would speak Tatar with one another, being in the historical realm of the Tatar Empire, with Tatar maintaining this high standing. So today it is clearly Russian is the language of intercultural communication. And if you are as an outsider, I've experienced this myself as somebody who speaks Mari quite well and whose Russian is quite limited. If I visit these Mari communities, people instinctively want to speak Russian to me because that is the language of intercultural communication. And it's, if you do not speak Russian fluently, people almost think that there's something not quite right with you. It is just considered such a basic part of the human experience to be fluent in Russian that it is hard to conceptualize that some people are not. And the reactions you get if you then try to speak Mari within these communities, this is not a perfect analogy, but it is kind of like, imagine you are a native speaker of American English and you go to Liverpool and you start trying to speak deep scows with people. The people would think that you're making fun of them at first. It would be hard to imagine that there is motivation beyond this. And this is what happens if you come from outside of the community and try to speak a language that people are not used to using as a language of intercultural communication. But obviously these things are fluid and flexible often, that people get used to it. If I spend enough time there and they realize how bad my Russian is and how good my Mari is, that they eventually start preferring to speak Mari. And a beautiful example of how fluid it can be, a language of intercultural communication in Yoshkar-Ola, the capital of the Mariel Republic, at university for a long time was Estonian, because in the former Soviet Union, the best Finno-Ugric studies program that you had was at the University of Tartu. And the best and brightest students all went to Estonia to study there and then returned to places like Yoshkar-Ola to study there, having spent 5 years in Estonia studying Mari. So when I was in Yoshkar-Ola the first time in 2008, at that point I did not know any Russian and my Mari was not great yet either, but I did speak a lot of Estonian. And to my big surprise, the language that I could mostly speak with people at the university in Yoshkar-Ola, it was not English, it was not German, it was Estonian, because everybody there spoke it.
Oh, that's brilliant! What a treat as well. You know, whoever said that Estonian wasn't an international language? That's fantastic. This is all wonderful, and I love hearing about the deep linguistic richness of Russia. Of course, it's going to be linguistically diverse. It's massive as a country. One thing, though, you know, we've mentioned, of course, the modern day influence of Russian, which is considerable. Can I assume that Mari is written in the Cyrillic alphabet? Or could we just talk a little bit, how is Mari written down? And also, is there a vibrant literary scene in this language? Are there books? Are there plays and poems written in Mari?
Yeah, so Mari is indeed written in Cyrillic. There is no known literary tradition using other alphabets, which is not to say that it didn't exist. Maybe there were some writings in Mari using the Arabic script, which was used for all the neighboring Turkic languages up to the 20th century. But as far as we know, outside of like the Mari diaspora in Estonia texting using the Latin alphabet or whatnot, Mari literacy always used the Cyrillic alphabet, but different versions of the Cyrillic alphabet. That in the 1920s and the 1930s, there was a version of the Cyrillic alphabet was used, which basically completely disregarded all the aspects of the Cyrillic alphabet that are tailored to the needs of Russian. And this is what was used in what we can call the golden age of Mari literacy, the second golden age I have mentioned today, in the 1920s and 1930s, when an absolutely massive amount of literature was produced in Mari. But in the late 1930s, we had the Stalinist purges, which were a disaster for the Mari community that they have not recovered from to today. That basically this whole intelligentsia that was built up in the early Soviet Union, they were en masse executed, all the people who had been producing all these literary works in Mari. And at the same time, there was also a decree came from Moscow that your orthography looks too weird and non-Russian, make your orthography look more Russian. So, and the forced orthographic reform that didn't happen in 1937, this is roughly still the orthography which is used today, that it in certain aspects, it mimics the Russian alphabet. It uses the whole duality of vowel signs, even though in Mari it makes very little sense. There are some slight defects to it, but it is still mostly functional. There are some adaptations over the Russian alphabet for some of the sounds that Mari has that Russian doesn't have. Most notably, in Mari you have an Ö and an Ü sound that you might know from German, Finnish, Estonian, and whatnot. And the German system of the diaeresis or an umlaut was just transferred to Mari. You put two dots on top of your letter to make the front variant. And then we also have a ligature for the velar nasal and where they just stuck the Russian letters of N and G and made a ligature of those both. And that is then also used in Mari. So even though we never had quite the literary production in Mari, again, as we had in the 1920s and 1930s, there is still a vibrant community that you do have, like you have a daily newspaper that shows up in Mari. You have a bunch of weekly publications. You have a monthly literature publication. It's like 100 to 200 pages, comes out once a month, is also published online at this point. You have some translations, especially from Finnish and Estonian into Mari that were funded by cultural programs in those countries. Also some minor things from Hungary. That, like, for example, a lot of poems by Sándor Petőfi, the Hungarian national poet, have been translated into Mari. There are some own productions of Mari too. Like my favorite Mari book is called Kécses a Cseh Jüdveleste, which means the sun is born or rises in the north. And it is an autobiographical tale of a Maori journalist who got the job to run an editorial office in Pevek on the Chukchi Sea in the far east of the Russian Federation. And it is a story of how he, as somebody coming from the west, which is to say Yoshkar-Ola, traveled to the far east, which say Pevek, and the culture shock he experienced going there. It's an absolutely fascinating read, experiencing somebody talking about culture shock in contrast to their culture, and their culture being one that has given me intense culture shock.
After that superb and thorough introduction to the Maori language, I feel very educated and enthused about Maori. But I would like to turn away from the language for the moment and talk about one person who I dare say has a fantastic and rich relationship with Maori, which is, of course, yourself, Jeremy. And in this, your reputation sort of precedes you. I mean, the first time I met you, which was in the centre of Prague, it was a mutual friend who, set up this meeting. It was a wonderful afternoon, very well spent. And he said, "Oh, Jeremy, the Maori guy." And I immediately said, "Oh yeah, the Maori guy." So I know that you are deeply involved with this language and the study of this language as a linguist and as a language learner. But I'd like to ask how and why. How did you come to know Maori? So just tell us, what is the story of your relationship with this language?
So Maori is not actually my first linguistic love. My first linguistic love was, as was the case for Johanna Laakso, Estonian. That is where my Uralic journey started. And some personal background of mine is that I was actually a computer scientist before I was a linguist. I studied computer science and I did linguistics as a side because being able to program is kind of like driving a car. It's not very meaningful unless you have some idea of where you want to drive with the car. Likewise, programming itself as a skill is only meaningful if you know what you want to program with it. I wanted to do things that interest me, so I started studying linguistics too, thinking that this intersection of IT competencies and linguistics would be fruitful, and so far it has been. So I was primarily studying Estonian, but in the course program at the University of Vienna, it was mandatory to do at least one minor Finno-Ugric language, where minor is understood as anything other than Finnish, Estonian, and Hungarian. This was put in place by Johanna Laakso and her colleagues at the time to ensure that people do not get the biased view of the Uralic languages that you would get if you just know the languages from the Western periphery. And it just so happened that Maori was the language that was offered when I was at the stage of my life where, firstly, I needed the credit, and secondly, I was up for new experiences. So I enrolled in the Maori class taught by Timothy Riese, started studying this language, and very quickly realized that, well, firstly, I just absolutely adored the language itself. I adored the sound of the language. I adored the structures of the language. Estonian will always have a special place in my heart, but as a speaker of German, Estonian is a lot more familiar, shall we say, than Maori is. Like if you're studying Estonian and you know German, you keep running into old friends. Whereas Maori feels like something, this could be from a different planet. It is structurally completely unfamiliar, aside from the word stems that I recognized from Estonian. I realized that I immediately took a liking to the language. And I also realized that there is a huge deficit as regards scholarly attention paid to these languages. There's actually stuff to do. Estonian, Finnish, and Hungarian all have national philologies working with them. Maori also has it to a smaller extent with the institutions that you have in Yoshkar-Ola as a status of a national language for this of a constituent of the Russian Federation, but it's not quite on the same level. There's not, for example, one thing I quickly realized is that there was no meaningful dictionary to use if you don't speak Russian. But there were printed Maori Russian dictionaries, but there was not anything that I could use. So I thought, well, I started chatting with Timothy Riese, my teacher and later doctoral supervisor, about it would be really nice if there was a Maori English dictionary. And eventually we came to, well, wouldn't it be nice if we actually compiled such a dictionary? And we ended up bringing in project funds to make this happen. If you're ever curious why I didn't sleep very much between 2010 and 2014, that is why, because I was busy creating a Mari English dictionary in that time frame. So there was just so much to do, and so much where also then my competency as a computer scientist was extremely useful to like process these huge amounts of data that we had for all these plans that we had. But there were also just immediately aspects of the language that immediately just took my heart and ran off with it. If I can give you one example, like in the syntax of this language, a lot of it is a lot more Eastern, shall we say, which is to say that there are certain grammatical structures that if you know Mari, you might look at the grammatical structures of Mongolian and you will recognize, oh yeah, we do the same thing, the way that reported speech works, for example. But specifically a feature I would like to talk about are the so-called converb constructions that we have in Mari. So converb is you might call these forms gerunds, depending on your linguistic background. It is a non-finite verbal form primarily used in combination with other verbs. So it would be like the ing forms in English can be fall sort of into this category in some cases, like you say the man stood there crying or whatnot. It modifies the crying, modifies the stood in this case. So Mari has like a huge body of pairings of verbs where you would say things like, I drinking sent a shot of vodka. Drinking sent, what is up with that? Well, if you think of sending, the act, and this is yun koltash in Mari, it is. Yun is drinking and koltash is to send. Originally, this verb meant like to let go, or like a raft in a river to send something downstream or whatnot. But what's up with this pairing? Well, if you think of the act of sending something away, sending off a letter, you have the letter in your hand, you go to the post box, you throw it in, and it is gone. You have changed the circumstances in the word in a way where you had something at the start of the action and you don't have it at the end. And you just take the structuring of an activity and you couple it with drinking, and you have drinking something tops up, drinking something until there's nothing left. Another example of this whole mechanism is falling in love in Mari, is loving placing. Why loving placing? Well, loving is a status verb. To love is a status. It describes what something is like in the word. Placing marks an activity where, like if you are placing a book on the shelf, you have something in your hand, you put it there, you have changed the circumstances in the word, and something that was not there before is now there. And if you take this aspect of placing and ignore like the activity itself and just sort of the structuring of the event and transfer it onto loving, but it is a changing of the structures of the word. You're adding something to it that was not there before. You have falling in love, or loving placing, as it is in Mari. And it is very cool to, when working with a language, constantly finding new ways to conceptualize the word that we live in that are perfectly logical, but that you never even considered before you studied this language.
I mean, it seems no stranger to me than saying falling in love, where in the preposition is about, being somehow within the walls or somehow confined by something. So, yeah, it seems no stranger to me than that. And yet, of course, being, a European language speaker, for me, it is alien. I don't know this at all. And it's fascinating. I suppose I have to ask, you've mentioned already that you've been out there, you've been on the ground in the Mariel Republic and in Russia. So you've been involved in language documentation, in working with speakers of the language. Could you tell us, what has that been like? What's the experience been? Is it positive, negative, enjoyable, or not? And also, has it been affected, your work on Mari, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and consequently the new political situation?
Yeah, so I have actually been more involved in language description than language documentation. I haven't really done much linguistic field work in the traditional sense of that I travel to some village and sit down with various grandmothers that I can find and get them to talk about various things while I record them. I've more been involved in the creation of reference materials like a dictionary, a textbook, a learner's grammar, a corpus, and other materials of this type. Interacting with community was at first somewhat shocking that when I started working with Mari, I just for fun, at some point, created a morphological generator, a paradigm generator, where you give in, you enter a noun in the nominative singular, and it gives you it creates the paradigm. And I showed this to my supervisor and asked him, does he think that this is in any way useful? And he said, well, it looks cool to me, but I don't feel competent to trust, like to verify its accuracy or anything like that. We should do that with like members of the community. So this was early 2008. As a naive young person, I Googled and I saw, can I find any online fora where people are chatting in Maori? And I found the forum of the Maori radio and the Maori music scene. And there was a Maori language forum there where people were chatting. So I registered there and I made a post where I, in very basic Maori, said, hello, my name is Jeremy Bradley. I am a linguist at the University of Vienna. I really like the Maori language. I have created this, and I am looking for Maoris who are willing to look at these things with me, not thinking much of it. And I think I posted this at some point, like late in the evening or during the night, and went to sleep. And the next morning I got up and there was something like, I opened my inbox and it was 72 new emails or something like that. And I thought, oh God, what has happened? One of those days. And it turned out that this was an absolute media sensation among the Maoris, that there was some IT guy in Vienna who was posting in Maori in one of their forums. And it was like, there were like articles in all the Maori newspapers and the such about this, because it was such an unexpected thing. So over the years, I traveled to Yoshkar-Ola, the capital of the Maori Republic, many times, also with student groups, which is always a didactically extremely valuable experience for them. We build up connections there. We cooperated and collaborated with scholars from among the community for many years in the creation of various resources that we have on our website, like the Maori English Dictionary, also reference materials on Hill Maori and the such. Obviously, these collaborations were a lot easier in 2010 than they are in 2024. The war has basically ended all possibilities to have direct interactions with formal interactions with members of the community in Mariel for the time being. We still have like private communication with people, but it is extremely awkward. As the Maoris are also among the people most affected by the war, in the way that the Maoris are being disproportionately drafted into the army to fight in Ukraine. And the Maoris that are drafted are often like sent into the meat grinder. They're the cannon fodder for the Russian army. And even if it would be formally possible, I would feel extremely awkward writing to friends and colleagues like, hope your family is safe. And by the way, do you have any opinions on these participle structures or anything of the sort? But of course, our desire to interact with the community has not been altered by all these circumstances. So we are still working with Maori things. We're still putting them out on the internet, and members of the community can still access them, hopefully, as long as the internet remains accessible in Russia. And we are still working with Maoris by thanks of the diaspora communities that we have. That there is a Maori diaspora community, especially in Estonia, and there are some Maori native speakers in Hungary. So we are still doing Maori like elicitations with Maori native speakers, but it's mostly then Maori over Zoom with Maori native speakers living in Hungary and Estonia.
Your enthusiasm and your commitment to this language, I think, is obvious for everyone to hear. But amidst all of that great joy in the Maori language, if I can get you to just choose one thing, one feature of this language, completely free reign, it's your choice, what is something that you love about Maori?
Something I love about Maori is that it is, of the languages I know, it is the most likely, if you come up with some kind of nonsense words that you don't think mean anything, Maori is a language in which it will likely mean something. Partially, this is because I have spent so much time staring at Maori that I have sort of lost my mind and start seeing Maori everywhere. But partially, I'm also convinced it is because of the very simple phonology and phonotactics of Maori, that the sound structures are so straightforward in Maori that it is very easy to hit something that exists in Maori. And the famous example of this is there's a well-formed sentence in Maori, Coca-Cola, which means the ant dies. So that was very amusing for the Maoris when Coca-Cola hit the Russian market around the end of the Soviet Union, that suddenly all over the stores, the ant was dying.
So many ants, so many dying ants.
There's also Motorola, which means beautiful city. You have you have certain, like, you have rhymes among the Maoris where where these are integrated. But it's also, even if you go to like small no-name shops, budget shops, where you have their knockoff brands with nonsense names or whatnot, you're running, if you know Maori, you're running through the aisles, and it's like, oh, that means something in Maori, that means something in Maori, that means something in Maori, that means something in Maori. This Ola, for example, that we have in Motorola, you might have heard already when I was referring to the capital of the Maori Republic, Yoshkar Ola. That simply means Red City. It's a city that used to be called under on the Tsar's time Tsarevo Kukshaisk, the Tsars in Russian, the Tsars city on the river Kukshaga, where it is. In the very early Soviet Union, where you didn't have any Tsar cities anymore, it became Krasno Kukshaisk in Russian, the Red City on the Kukshaga. And then in this period of active support for minority languages in Russia, it became Yoshkar Ola in Maori, the Red City.
With regret, I have to move you on to the third and final question, the fourth part of the whole episode, at least until your, triumphant return with Mari Part 2 or some other language in the future. But for the moment, what is a feature of this language or this language's story that you would like to leave listeners with? Tell us, what's your parting point about the Mari language?
As is always the case, a language is, on the one hand, the symbols seem completely arbitrary. On the other hand, they can tell a story of the language's history. And in Maori, we can see this rather transparently. We have heard of like the Russian influence there is on Maori, and in modern Maori, there certainly is a Russian influence, but we have these absolutely centuries of Turkic influence in Maori too, and Turkic of different stripes. That we have the Tatar influence, Tatar being a sort of, if I can say this, a more mainstream Turkic language that is comparatively similar to Turkish, but then we also have a lot of Chuvash influence, and Chuvash is the wild child of the Turkic language family, and so we have all this Chuvash influence here. And then we also have a lot of cultural transmission through these languages and the cultures that spoke them. That a lot of the word stock that we have in Maori is ultimately Persian and Arabic, just from as being on the fringes of the wider Islamic world. And there's a lot of like Islamic cultural artifacts in Maori that people do not have the meta understanding of them, what it is. Like Hai in Maori is salam. A priest in Maori paganism is the mullah. So we recognize these things, but then the speakers of Maoris don't necessarily generally have no idea where these things comes from. And as a result of this, for example, you have this strange phenomenon that sometimes, like, I will look at an Indonesian word list and I will recognize a bunch of words because it is on the other fringe of the wider Islamic word in the wider sense, and also has its Arabic cultural transmission. So, for example, there's a Maori word kuat, meaning strength, and in Indonesian, kuat means strong. Same stem, same Arabic stem in both cases. And I think Maori is a very, very nice example, of course, from my biased view, of just how much history modern language, arbitrary as it might seem at the first sight, carries with it.
That is such a great point. I love the fact that you can find cognates within Indonesian and Maori, thousands of miles apart from one another, but there you go. People travel, and their languages travel with them. A super point there to end on. All I could just say is just thank you so much, Jeremy, for coming on today, for sharing your love and your deep knowledge of the Maori language. I think this is great because you've given us not only an introduction and a potted history of Maori and its speakers, but also, of course, the wider context of Russia, this diversity that I think people in the West just don't know about. We can't assume that any of the languages that you've mentioned actually will be familiar to people, apart from Russian. So wonderful. Final questions from me is that if people would like to know more about your work, if people would like, for example, to find out what you do with Maori and and this amazing dictionary that you've worked on. Where can people find you online?
Well, as common as my name is within the English-speaking world, it is not common in Austria. So if you just Google Jeremy Bradley Vienna, you have found me. You have found my university website. Also, I operate the website www.mari-language.com, which is where we collect all the reference materials for Mari that we have created. So if you want to have a look at our 700 plus pages textbook of Mari for autodidactic learners of the language, or our 80 plus hour video course of Mari that we have created, or our Mari English Dictionary, it's all on that website.
Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on today. I think this episode could easily turn into 3 hours. I just love listening to all of this, but we'll just have to have you back for Mari Point 2 or for something else. But for the moment, at least, thank you so much.
Thanks again for having me. And as I say in Mari, Veskana Ushmeshke, until we meet again.
Before this episode ends, there's a little time left for my final fun fact. As regular listeners will know, this is my chance to share a morsel of language info that I reckon you'll find interesting. Here's one. What word can link Russian railways to a 13th century Anglo-Norman knight? The knight in question is Fawkes de Breaute, who served King John and King Henry III of England. He gave his name to the London area of Vauxhall, Folks Hall, where in 1661 a formal garden was later established. This garden was so popular and influential that Vauxhall became a word for a public garden in various European languages, including French, German, Polish, and Russian. Now, in the 1830s, with the building of a railway between St. Petersburg and Pavlovsk, a Vauxhall was built to complement the project and attract users. It was through this association between railways and public gardens that today, amazingly, the Russian word for a station is vokzal. That's everything for this first episode of Series 2. Heartfelt thanks must go to my guest today, Jeremy, and of course to you, dear listener, for listening. Listen out for further episodes very soon, and in the meantime, keep well and keep loving language.